Now, one thing that's interesting though is Father Kim really dominates the development of early Korean Catholic history and historiography, but he's not the only person. There's another person who's very important, but has been kind of marginalized. I think she has the bad luck for two reasons. One is that she was younger than Father Kim by about 15 years, so she was his junior. In Korea, that's a big deal. When you're that much younger than someone, it's hard to, you kind of live in their shadow. And also, Korea was a very, and to some degree, is still very patriarchal. So the fact that she's a woman made it so that her ideas were kind of marginalized. But Sister Anna Kim Oki is also very important in the development of Korean Catholic historiography. So I want to also tell her story very briefly. Like Father Che, she was born into a Catholic family. She became a nun right out of high school. She joined a new order called the Sisters of the Blessed Korean Martyrs. So you can see here a kind of patriotism, right? You have an order of nuns dedicated to the Korean martyrs. And she will be trained as a teacher. And she will always be teaching at different levels, sometimes at college, but she actually ran a kindergarten for a while. And somehow she basically stumbled in a bookstore upon a book on torture and started studying that. You may say that's kind of odd. Why would a Korean Catholic nun start studying torture? Well, that's because those tortures were used against Korean Catholics during the time of persecution. So she knew that Korean Catholics had suffered persecution, had suffered torture, and she discovered, books on how this was done and decided to study that. She actually would have built a replica of the devices used to torture Korean Catholics. In order to better understand these books, she would also start studying classical Chinese, and it gives you a sense of the patriarchy that she had to deal with. Her teacher of classical Chinese was very conservative and didn't want to teach an unmarried woman. Didn't like teaching a single woman. She's kind of like, I'm a nun. I'm already attached. It's not like I'm this flighty single woman as if, single women can't be responsible or something like that. Like it's just a very odd idea from our perspective. But this conservative teacher just didn't like teaching her Chinese because she was a single woman. She's like, I don't think you understand what being a nun is. But she had to deal with that kind of patriarchy a lot. Like Father Kim, she would also study in Europe and learn how to do critical history in Europe. And similar to Father Kim, she would come back and work on developing her own institution in the 1970s and 80s. However, she's doing it late, right? He's ahead of her, so she's going to be kind of on the margins. And she's going to have a different focus. Father Che tended to focus more on men. He's a priest, and on priests. And on the church government, she's going to focus a lot on women, particularly martyrs as well as perpetual virgins. These were women who promised never to marry. And so they weren't nuns per se, because they didn't actually belong to a convent, but they were women who were going to not marry and try and live a religious life that way. And they're basically the precursors of nuns. So she's going to try and study women who in some ways are similar to her, which makes sense. And it's interesting because she will refer to these delicate women, but then say something like, how did these delicate women die as brave martyrs? And what she's trying to do, and it sounds kind of odd at first, but it does make sense. She's trying to challenge patriarchy. She's trying to say, you say these women are delicate and weak, and I'm going to play along for a moment, but I'm going to show you how these women were really strong. So it's interesting because there's a kind of feminism to this otherwise very conservative nun, right? If you look at her theology, it's very Orthodox conservative Catholicism. But she's going to argue that just as in a sense that these delicate women were able to become martyrs, so therefore delicate women like we nuns, we should be taken seriously too. So she makes this kind of interesting argument from the margins. She's particularly interested in literature. She had a background in literature as well. She studied that. And in showing the importance of Catholicism in developing people's literature. So for example, she translated a bunch of poems by a Korean priest and argued that these poems, which were meant as kind of songs to help teach lay Catholics about their faith, that these were an example of the literature of the people. And when you start talking about literature of the people, that's what I mean about Catholics being these kind of moderate progressives in Korean politics. But she's trying to show how Korean Catholicism is a central part of Korean history. It's not just for Catholics. It's not just on the margins. But hey, we helped develop Korean literature. And it's interesting because she's going to develop a museum slash holy site in a place called Oriunde in Busan, right? So Father Che is going to be in the center. He's in Seoul, where he's going to develop his Church History Institute, the archives I mentioned earlier. She's down in Busan, which is still an important city, but far from the political center. And that's where she's going to develop her area. And it's going to be similar to the Church History Institute. It's got a library. It's got places to study. This is it on the outside. It's very beautiful. That's an important Korean Catholic nationalist pictured there to kind of remind us how Korean Catholics are trying to show it they're a part of the history, of the important part of Korean history. And it has a museum, which shows, tells the story of Korean history. But what's also interesting is it's a holy site. So there's the graves of martyrs. There's a place to say the rosary. There's a rosary path. There's a Lord's grotto. There's all these places for Catholic devotionals. So whereas Father Che, even though he did understand himself as a church historian, he tends more towards the secular side in many ways. He tends not to make history devotional in terms of religion, whereas Sister Kim tends to do that, right? So she's going to develop Korean historiography in a way that's different, in the sense that she's going to focus more on women, more on devotional practices, but is also similar in that she is a real historian. She's very careful about her documents and making sure that that's all set. So I hope you found this interesting, this kind of journey through Korean Catholic history, very different in some ways, removed from Western traditional history, but we can see how you have those influences there on it.